All right, let's call this committee meeting to order. It's the committee that regulates and taxes the cultivation and manufacturing of commercial sale of marijuana in Anchorage. I just think we should call it the MJ committee. Anyway, let's go around and do some attendance here. We'll start with Ira.
Ira, permit for Ernie Hall, Bruce Schulte, you'll be 15 minutes late.
Okay, thank you.
Tim C.
Free training assembly.
Pete Peterson, Assembly.
Sean Case, Anchorage Police.
Seneca Atheno, City Prosecutor. Amanda Moser, Clerk's Office.
Bill Fossey, Municipal Attorney.
Mandy Honest, Clerk's Office.
Audience members?
Christy White, I work with the City Prosecutor's Office.
Anna Brawley, I work for Agnew-Beck Consulting, but I'm not her.
Okay.
Jessica Jansen, and I hope to be in some sort of industry.
Chris Usher, hope to be in the industry.
Pete Haywood.
Wait.
Mark Malagotti, I'm working on starting a testing lab.
Liz Cruz from Treasury.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for everyone for coming today.
Chairman, I
And
just want to say that I'm on the phone. This is Amy talking.
Ms. Domboski is calling in from lovely Eagle River today. She's not feeling too well. Mr. Hall, who normally is the chair of this committee, is out of state right now. Last time I talked to him, he was in Oregon driving down the coast.
Tuesday, Oregon, I talked to him, 74 degrees. No 74.
Yeah, well, it's rough down there in Oregon right now. But it was interesting today. I was actually reading the paper, and there were a couple articles in the paper dealing with marijuana today. One that Devin Kelly from ABN had written. Another was a letter to the editor from Senator Johnny Ellis. And I thought that was actually a really good letter. He's talking about legalizing the growth of hemp. I mean, our Constitution was written on hemp paper, so it's not like it's a new invention. And I actually think that there's a ton of potential to grow industrial hemp here in Alaska. So I was actually happy to see that.
Well, let's not have the state do it. They haven't done too well when they grow things.
No, private industry would
That'd
do
be
just
fine.
fine. And we could make Alaskan grown paper, we could call it, or something, you know? Anyway, let's go and do some of our traditional reports. Is anyone here from the State of Alcohol Control Board? I don't see.
That'll be Bruce.
Okay, we'll have him do that when he gets here then. How about from Sean from the Anchorage Police Department?
We got nothing for you right now.
Nothing? You know, I took a walk through the park the other day to go downtown and grab some lunch, and I just wanted to let Mr. Trainee know that I didn't smell anyone smoking marijuana in the park when I walked through there the other day. I think it might be that it's getting a little chilly outside, but just wanted to report that. A report from the legal department.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So, as you mentioned, Devin Kelly did report on our marijuana efforts in today's paper. We have let regular chair, Mr. Hall, know, and several others that the administration has now instantiated a working group structure to make sure that this issue doesn't get away from us. And we're looking at it in a comprehensive way, and we have assigned different individuals to take on different portions of this large puzzle. So the 6 pieces that we have described for you and for others have been the land use plan, the licensing, criminal law pieces, the public health edibles, the revenue portion, and finally MOA personnel goals. We hope to be able to bring more concrete proposals to this committee in relatively short order.
Mr. Trainee.
Will you be writing an ordinance you guys have done? Is that what you're looking to do?
Through the chair, our goal is to have all of the ordinances that we would need to have in place by February 24th. So one of our initial tasks is to build a timeline that works backwards from that date, so we can sequence up how all of the public hearings would have to work out, and then we will be ready with all the necessary.
We can provide all the public hearings you need. I just want to make sure we get it in time, have a full public hearing before we need to have legislation there. Thank you.
Anything else?
At this time.
All right, thank you, great. And I don't see Erica here from the planning department. She's on leave this week. And how about clerk's office? Are you going to be getting your report
Yeah.
later on the agenda? Okay. And federal and state regulations on distances from schools. Is Rob Martin here? Maybe he'll get here a little bit later. I guess the focus of this meeting then will be the presentation by Amanda Moser about dual licensing. You have the floor.
Thank you. Through the chair, my name's Amanda Moser, and I work in the clerk's office. The clerk's office handles business licenses and the liquor license for the municipality of Anchorage. So we receive applications from the ABC board for liquor licenses, and we process them through the various departments within the municipality, and then we put them before the assembly for approval. So we have been looking at marijuana through the lens of our experience with liquor licenses, and also there's about 7 business licenses that at one point in time the assembly has identified a public safety risk and has created a license to address that public safety risk. So working with the assembly, I have been exploring licensing for marijuana as it could play out in Anchorage. And one thing that I took away from the trip to Colorado in January was a couple jurisdictions had a dual licensing system where operators would get a state license, and then in order to operate within that jurisdiction, they would also need to qualify for a municipal license. And that's something that we're exploring for Anchorage. And for various reasons, I think we've had challenges over the years with liquor licenses. That might be a way to give the assembly a little bit more control for regulation on it. So that being said, I've done a significant amount of research looking at the regulations that are still in draft form that the state has put out. And I'd like to go through, I've sort of identified some questions that we can work through today. So in the back table, if you haven't picked it up, there's a graph sheet. We can just sort of go through these questions that might come up when we're talking about licensing for the municipality. And as we move forward with this process, we're going to just continue to closely monitor the state regulations. And I think it's really important to communicate. We are not exploring this to make it more cumbersome or complicated for potential operators. I think we want to make it address public safety concerns that we're hearing from the constituents. But, as much as we can, stick to what the state has pulled out. I think the state has done a really great job of identifying the concerns that we've had, and so there potentially is not a lot of room for additional regulations beyond what the state has, but just being able to address it on the municipal level. So just to go through this, the first question, and this is, I think, a big question, and questions 1 and 2 kind of go together. Should the total number of marijuana establishment licenses be limited? And this is something that has just kind of come up over and over again in our internal conversations and publicly. Do we want to limit the number of marijuana establishments that we're going to allow in Anchorage? And it kind of goes hand in hand with the second questions of should licenses be transferable, because if there is a limit on the number of marijuana licenses, it potentially gives them a secondary market value, and there might be some need to be able to have them transferable. So the pros of limiting the number of marijuana licenses is it might allow a slow start, a more controlled, and we can expand later if things are working well for the municipality. And it would allow needed municipal staff to grow slowly along with the industry here in Anchorage. But I think some of the cons are it's going to be very difficult to establish a fair way to distribute licenses. And recognizing that businesses that want to go into this industry are going to have to secure a location and use a significant amount of investment to get started. And that could be challenging if they don't know whether or not they would get a municipal license in the end. I think it would be difficult to establish a number of licenses that's justifiable. And in the same conversation about having it be transferable or not, it potentially adds value to the license. And so this is something we've seen with liquor licenses. They are, by state statute, limited based on population. So for example, restaurant eating place licenses, which is the beer and wine liquor license that you see around town, there's one for every 1,500 people, so there's more of those. The full bar, the beverage dispensary license, there's one for every 3,000 people. Because in Anchorage, because there's no longer the availability of new beverage dispensary liquor licenses, they have a market value of $200,000 to $250,000 to purchase one of those. And that's just because you can't get a new one. So just some follow-ups on that. How many licenses of each establishment would be available? So would we have based on the retail, cultivation, manufacturing, testing? And I think still coming back to what process would we use to choose the successful applicants? And I really think it's important to recognize that with the high cost of state licenses and the high cost to operate, and if we address concerns through regulations, there potentially is not going to be the need to put a limit on licenses if we're addressing the public's concerns. So that is something for the assembly to think about. I don't know if anyone has any.
Any comments about that? Tim?
If the state law has to come first, can we do it like we do the alcohol licenses in terms of subject to kind of clause? Can their license be subject to approval by the city, or can, if they do not have a location, can we approve a license subject to approval of location?
Through the chair, I think that's one thing that we're looking at with the dual licensing concept is that for an establishment to operate within the municipality of Anchorage, they would need to have a state license, state marijuana license, and a municipal license, and they couldn't operate unless if they have the two licenses.
But I mean, if we limit the number in certain areas or to various areas, they need a location before we will approve a license. They can still get their state license and shop for the right area to put it in.
It's my understanding that to operate with the state license, they'll need to have a specific location.
Yeah, I don't mean operate. I mean actually physically get the license from the state and then shop the city to find a place where they want to do it before they get our local license.
Yeah, tentative, yes. So they would establish a location and apply for their state license. And it would be my understanding that while this state is processing their license, they would come in and apply for the municipal license and we would process it.
So it's all front-end speculation on their part, and they may not get what they want from either the state or
Potentially.
Mr. Dombowski actually has a question. Go ahead, Amy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had a couple questions, Amanda. What is the state doing as far as the Marijuana Control Board? Do you see any direction? Are they going to be limiting state licenses to a certain number?
Through the chair, and it's my understanding that they're not intending to limit the number of licenses. I think that it's my understanding that they recognize that they can address concerns through regulations instead of a limitation on it.
Okay, that leads to my second. And I think many of us have expressed. I know Mr. Trini and myself have said it numerous times, but the answer to your question number 2, in my view, is an absolute no. They should not be transferable. I don't think. I know I'm skipping ahead a little. But when it comes to the dual licensing, I think one of the real benefits of that is one of the prerequisites for having a municipal license is you have to have a state license. a lot of applicants will be weeded out in that process, I would assume. And so I think it would actually be really helpful, to make that one of the cornerstones, obviously, if they kind of have that in their pocket when they come to us, because I think it'll help the work process actually weed through a lot of unnecessary applications that otherwise might be coming through. But that's just one thought. But like I said, I don't know really what my position is yet as far as should we limit the number of licenses or not. I think you're right, Amanda, in that you might be able to, there's a very real possibility and argument to be made that through your regulations and your process, I think that might be sufficient. So that's it's a good question to ask. I don't know that I can give you an answer. My gut tells me no, don't limit the number. But I think it's premature for me to say because I'm not quite certain yet how this is going to shape up. So,
Mr. Training.
Maybe what I see is use as conditional use process. If they get a state license, that's fine, but they still got to find a place to operate it. And that's where we come into the city, because unless we get conditional use, they can't go to the application. Because we're going to have a lot of discussions from community councils. They're concerned about a place opening up in their neighborhood. We're going to have to take that into account. And we'll end up in the same place we were with alcohol licenses. Conditional use is the only vehicle we have to control it, because it's licensed by the state. So, what's your comment?
I think that the dual licensing will give us additional control beyond the land use control that we have through what is with liquor licenses a conditional use permit and what the special land use permit for marijuana would be. So I think that what you're saying is exactly correct, but I just want to add the additional caveat that we will have, when we're addressing issues through land use that's specific to the land, and we can't address everything through that, but licensing will allow us to address non-land use specific concerns that are brought up by both the assembly and the general public.
Amanda, off the top of your head, what increase in staff would we have to have for your office to be able to do this? I know it's just speculation now, but you did learn from Colorado. And they hired a lot of people, if I remember correctly.
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure if Colorado is exactly going to be the same as Alaska. I think that Colorado's regional location may have had some impacts on the sales and increased demand and whatnot. I'm not sure we will see the same growth and boom here. I don't know the answer to these things.
Well, as you're working on this case, because I don't want to hurt the staff we've got now. No, we're working the point they can't do their job.
I thank you for bringing it up, and I think it's something that we will communicate directly to the assembly. But as of right now, I think we've had some changes in licensing currently. We're no longer licensing massage practitioners, which was a large component of the work done by our business license official in the clerk's office. So there's a low capacity for extra currently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I wanted to note for the record that Mr. Schulte has joined us. And Ms. Tucker has got a question, I believe.
No, I'm good. I just wanted to support Amanda's the dual licensing, and that as Mr. Trainee questioned and Amanda hit right on the nail, is that in the liquor situation, we see that there are many things outside of land use, and Mr. Trainee is coming from a background of several establishments even before the time I got here, that like the Call of the Wild, that the assembly had a lot of difficulty in maintaining sort of law and order and other things outside of land use, and part of that was because the ABC board situation does not allow the city to license liquor establishments because it's preempted. Here it's not preempted, and so it's another another way to address those public safety issues that don't, as Amanda just pointed out, that fall outside the land use environment.
All right, great. Continue, Amanda.
So, as I said when I began talking, I think questions 1 or 2 are intrinsically linked. If we limit the number of licenses, there's probably going to be a demand to allow them to be transferable. I think it's going to create a secondary market for them. If they're not limited, then a new owner could always come in and get a new license, and there wouldn't be a need for them to be transferred. And this is something that we see currently with our business licenses. Our business licenses in the clerk's office are not transferable. So if you are a tow operator and you sell your tow company, the new owner of that tow company comes in and they apply for a new tow operator's license. There's no limit on them. Come in, we get a new application, we're able to go through all the reviews that are required for the tow operator license with that new applicant. And so if there's not a limit on marijuana establishments, if a business is sold to another owner, they would come in, they would apply for a new license, we would run through all the same reviews. So I think questions 1 and 2 are something that we'll continue to come back to as we move forward in this discussion, but I think it's something that if you just keep it in your head as we're talking about the dual licensing system, that this is one area where the assembly could create an element of control, but there's a series of pros and cons that come with that. So just to hop down to question 3. Yeah.
Go ahead.
The cons is left blank on this chart. Is that?
It's hard because they're so tied together.
So would it be fair to say that the cons on this include the situation that you described about having the secondary market in licenses and all of the bundle of things that go with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I just want to make sure that that's what I was hearing.
Mr. Training?
Amanda, what we don't want to do is create a secondary market. As we found with alcohol, we found with taxing gas. We do not want to create a secondary market. So keep that in mind.
That is my concern with capping the number of licenses, is that it creates a value to them. And it's also the interesting thing too, so with liquor licenses, I mentioned earlier that there's no more new beverage dispensary licenses that are available. So they are sold on the market and they go for $200,000 to $250,000
Or higher.
The ABC board that money does not come back to the state agency that regulates and supports these licenses. It's out there on the regular market. So if there was a cap, we would encounter that. We potentially could encounter that similar situation.
Would they be numbered based upon what? Based upon community council areas, based upon what?
That is
Total number?
Oh, excellent question. So, and that is we've had an internal conversation about how you would even begin to limit the number of licenses and how would you choose who gets those licenses. And I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think you could look by community councils, you could look by assembly sections, you could go by the number of people, but that you would have to create a matrix and you could auction them. I mean, we got in an internal working group, ran around in circles, and then finally tabled the conversation because there's really an endless different ways that you could do it.
And if that license has to have an address attached to it, if the operator finds that address is not economically making it, they have to give up the license, or can they find another spot and come and say, hey, I'd like to transfer this license to where?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to those. I mean, I think that ties it to, are you capping the number of licenses, and are they transferable?
And how do you keep them all located in one spot? You know?
And I think that one of the great things about starting fresh with this is that you don't specifically need to do that by capping the number of licenses, but maybe you could do it through the land use. So maybe you would have limitations listed out in land use that could guide that, so you don't have a super dense area, but it wouldn't specifically be capping the license. I think there's a lot of things for the assembly to consider as we move forward with this.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Ms. Dombrowski has a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for I was having a hard time hearing in the beginning. What assembly members are present today?
Mr. Steele, Mr. Trainee, and myself.
Okay. So what I'm thinking, and Amanda, you just went right where I was going. So as I'm listening to the conversation, I think you're solidifying my position, actually. I think the answer is no to number one. We shouldn't, because as we've expressed, we don't want this secondary market. And I think your example of tow operators was a good one. But that's weaving into the land use component. So one of the things obviously we're going to be looking at in land use is this over density in one particular area or another. And I think through land use regulations, we can manage that, the density factor, let's call it that. But at the same time, so that could be one way to control that mechanism of it. But I think, the number one thing we've all seen with the alcohol industry or the taxi industry, we do not want the secondary market. So if an operator, has a business that they're selling or whatever, then the new guy or girl has to come in and get a new license. I think it's just that simple. And then I think that's the way to curtail that. But I think you're right in that if we limit the actual number, saying we will only issue 100, then it automatically leads to a law of economic growth, and you're going to create value there. So I think you're right. And I think, so for me, again, I would say at this point, thinking about the opportunities and the tools that we can use in land use, I think that the answer to the first question would be no for me. And the answer to the second question would again be no for me. So I don't think they should be limited, because I think we can manage the market as much as we need to, just through regulation. And I think I don't want to see them being transferable.
Thank you, Ms. Dombrowski. Ms. Tucker?
I'm thinking that Mr. Steele asked a different question than what may have been intended about the transfer, and he points out that in the liquor environment we have transfer of the license to a different owner, but that within the word transferable, he's reading a second thing that might be important to break out of this. That's not really about limiting the number of licenses, but instead is about changing location by the same owner, and that might be taken care of through some sort of license amendment process, and would have to be tied into the conditional use. So I think that it's important to sort of separate in your thinking here the transfer of location by an operator who already has a license and just has gone through whatever process needs to be on the state side and the land use side to identify a different location to exercise the license, as opposed to that secondary market where you sell the license. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Tucker. And
Mr. Chair, can I just add on to what Julia just said?
go ahead.
So and I thought that too, the only caution I would throw is if an operator who already has a license wants to change location, I think that authorization, whether it's an amendment process or whatever it is, I think changing of locations also should go back to the assembly.
Oops. Thank you, Mr. Bosky. I was going to ask Mr. Schulte if his committee had touched on any of these topics, or have you written regulations dealing with this, and what are they?
We have, absolutely. And first of all, I apologize for being late because the Marijuana Control Board just adjourned, and then I hurried over here. I should preface this by saying that the state's regs are still in draft form and they're not adopted yet. In the current draft of the regulations, the licenses are non-transferable. So if an individual or a group that holds a license, if they want to sell the business, the new owner or owners would need to go back to the state and apply and qualify for a license completely independently. So the licenses there would not be that secondary market for the licenses. The same would apply to a change of location. So if they were going to a new address, same thing, they'd have to go through the licensing process again.
So we're going to have a duplicate process between the state and local.
Sounds like, yes, Mr.
Well, if they
King.
came in for change of location, they'd have to come to us for conditional use permit.
Yes.
For a new
I'll have to show you
location.
when I come in a meeting.
Because we want to be able to control where they're at.
Sure. Mhm. Yeah, I'm sure, yeah, that would be expected in acreage.
And why is the state trying to control where they're located, the specific site, as opposed to maybe the jurisdiction?
Through the chairman, Mr. Steele, I don't think they're trying to control it exactly. They want to make sure that all the same operating parameters are met wherever the business is. So, for example, giving the community the opportunity to weigh in. If somebody's moving from outside the municipality of Anchorage into the municipality, that would be, obviously that would trigger a whole different discussion. Even just moving within the municipality, much of the discussion is centered around getting feedback from the local government, basically acknowledging that they're okay with the parameters of that business and that location. So it's expected that any new location or new business owner would have to get that same buy-in from the community.
Mr. Steele?
I sat in on the Public Safety Committee the other day, and we were dealing with the massage licensing, massage parlor issue. And what I'm hoping we're not doing is getting into duplication between the state and local government in terms of who controls what. If the state requires approval of the location and those types of things, other than the jurisdiction, I suppose, and then the local does too. If I was an operator or trying to be an operator, I would think it's double jeopardy, and I'm happy to make my case to both. Is that an efficient way for us to operate?
If I may just, yeah, I share your concern. I can say that the nature of the discussion has been that we wanted to avoid the transferability of licenses because that's been problematic in alcohol, but we absolutely wanted to preserve the ability of local government to apply tighter restrictions if they felt it necessary, and to apply zoning guidelines if they felt it necessary.
Mr. Trainor?
It's like what we've done with alcohol. In some cases, some of the stores have to have enhanced security, video cameras. You may find that with some of the stores selling this product, and some we may not find it.
Right.
But it depends on how the operator works in his neighborhood or her neighborhood.
Right. That is a valid point, Mr. Gurney, and I will say that the provisions or the requirements for security cameras in particular are extensive. Almost every square inch of a facility is going to have to be under video surveillance.
That's always been, through the chair, that's always been a concern we've had, because community councils come in and say, all these things are going on. If we have videotape, then we can find either right or they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. And again, through the chair, Mr. Trainor, again, under the current draft, there's a requirement that video footage be maintained of all portions of the facility, whether it's a grow or a retail facility, and that those records be kept for a period of time thereafter. So it's really quite extensive. So
Good.
hopefully, again, I think I've expressed this before. I would hope that, and by the way, I'd be happy to just go through and kind of break down some of those key elements from the 9 articles now that we have them.
If you got them, let me
I could,
copy of
appreciate it.
I'd be happy to do that. There's a lot of material that we just waded through. My head still hurts, but I'd be happy to break out some of the more salient points that I think you would find of
Good.
interest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. And I was just going to say that I think it has to be some way for a person to transfer the license to a family member. Either they list the family member on the license when they originally apply, and if one person passes away or decides that they want to retire, they'd be able to transfer it to someone who's already listed on the license. What about that?
Interestingly enough, just today we were talking about the circumstance where a sole licensee dies, and there was discussion and some inclusion in the regs about what would happen to their facility and their license. The expectation is, and again, this kind of goes back to the Cole memo and the need to ensure that this industry is not functioning as a shadow industry for organized crime or so forth. So the requirement for background checks and scrutiny of and verification of every licensee, and that would be everybody on the license, is pretty extensive. Whereas in alcohol, you could have some limited involvement with the business and not be named on the license. That's probably not going to be the case with marijuana at the state level.
Okay,
One
Mr.
last
Trainee.
thing, Mr. Chairman. You'd have to have a background check too on the alternate person on the license, because what if they were convicted of a felony?
Exactly.
Because I understand what you've written, they can't have a felony in the last 5 years.
Right.
So you need to have a check on the individual and anybody that's going to inherit it or take it over.
If anybody who's, I'm sorry, through the chair, anybody who is a licensee whose name is on the license, they would have to meet that requirement. And the background checks are going to be extensive. And I would just add that provision, the felony provision, is actually stipulated by the legislature, not the regulatory board. So that's ours. We own that whether we want to or not.
Julia.
I'm going to go back to something that Mr. Steele said and tie it into something that I heard Bruce talk about. So I'm thinking that, and this is, and everything's all preliminary here. So, but I'm thinking that what Mr. Schulte said is that there's a concern on the state side to make sure that on transfer the city or the local jurisdiction gets to weigh in. And what I'm hearing Mr. Steele say is that the local jurisdiction has a couple of options presented here on weigh-in on the front end, one being licensing and the second one being conditional use. And that if the local jurisdiction creates a system so that transferability needs to go through that local process again for this is transferability by location or by person, goes through a land use and a license update, then having the local jurisdiction go through it again for purposes of weigh-in there might not be the most efficient. And so that's the background for this question, which is if the municipality, if a local jurisdiction such as Anchorage does create a dual local license and the conditional use process, and does have an internal mechanism that says that they have to go through this, then would the state accept that new local license and new conditional use permit that they've gone through as the new process, so that the jurisdiction doesn't have to now create the same thing just to meet the standard?
To the chair, Ms. Tucker, I'm not sure if that would be true in all cases. I do agree that there could be a duplication of effort that would be inefficient. Could be inefficient, and it may be really helpful. The more I think about it, for me to articulate, some of those things like security requirements, an operating plan, odor control, the things that we know the municipality would be interested in reviewing. And it might be helpful to list all those things in draft form at the state level. And then you could look at supplementing those, augmenting them, at the local level, so that we could avoid some of that duplication. There is a very clear acknowledgement at the state level that of the local government's role in this process. That was articulated in the ballot measure, and it's something that has sort of guided a lot of our discussions. So. But then, also there is a question of efficiency, and having two different bodies do background checks, for example. I think that would probably be inefficient. I'm not even sure if that would be part of the municipality's process. But reviewing a security plan. If a security plan is already a part of someone's operating plan when they go to the state, I can't imagine why that same information wouldn't just be forwarded to the municipality for their review. So it may not need to be a separate process, but it could just be a process whereby some group here, in Anchorage, gets that packet and has their own checklist to compare, to look through for the information that they know is going to be there, because it has to be, or the state's not going to give them a license. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
All right, let's keep moving forward with Amanda and her presentation.
I just really want to clarify that on our end, we're doing that. We're looking at the state's regulations, and we are identifying where the state is already requiring security cameras and requiring these things. And I'm trying to identify areas that there's potentially additional concern that we might want to address as the municipality of Anchorage. I think it's really important to communicate that we're not trying to create a duplicative process. We're not trying to make it cumbersome, and we're not trying to slow it down or do anything. We just want to explore an opportunity to allow the local governing body and the assembly additional elements of control, where potentially in the past, when we haven't had a dual licensing system, we haven't had that additional elements to address concerns that come up, or specific municipality of Anchorage regulations that we want. I really want to make sure that we're communicating on our end that we're not trying to make this really complicated. And my vision would be that you would bring all of your paperwork for your state application, and you would just bring it to the municipality, and we would process from there. It wouldn't be an additional 30-page application that you would have to fill out. We would be able, because I think the state has done an excellent job of addressing these security concerns, these concerns on the limit of products sold and stuff like that. There might not be a lot of stuff that we additionally want to address, but by having the dual licensing system, we on the local level might be able to respond and address problem operators maybe faster or in our own way without going through the ABC board process. So I'm thankful that the work that the ABC board is doing on this, I think that a lot of concerns are already being addressed.
Mr.
However it
Steele?
works out to work with that, it could be as simple as a subject to approval of the certification by the other kind of thing. Depending on who's got the expertise, who can do it more efficiently, and so on.
And we're working through this, understanding it's all in draft form, so as changes roll out.
We just changed it all today.
You're going to go get all the new Post-it notes.
I'm kidding.
So, in the interest of moving on, I'd like to hop down to number 4, and we can come back. I think number 3 is kind of a long conversation. But these are just opportunities for the assembly to weigh in. One thing that, I'm going to thank Chair Trainee on this is the assembly has provided the funding for a code enforcement officer to work with business licenses in Title 10 for the clerk's office, and we've worked with this code enforcement officer over the last year to address concerns with tow operators and some of our other business licenses that have come up. And so one thing we've worked on is inspections and different elements of that. And so one opportunity for the assembly to continue that work on this level would be if they want to require inspections for the marijuana establishments as part of the license. So pros of this, it would give the assembly control over this new industry. and able to verify if we have different regulations beyond the state's regulations, that those are being followed. Con is this is potentially we might need to hire another code enforcement officer. So in the comparison to alcohol, currently the ABC board handles enforcement on the specific liquor licenses, and through the municipality, both code enforcement and APD can handle conditions on the conditional use permits. So this code enforcement officer could look specifically at the municipal license and concerns that that have come up with that. Some considerations, you might want to include yearly inspections. Maybe you want to have an inspection for renewal or a random inspection. And this is just something on the local level to be able to understand what is going on at these different establishments. It's a good opportunity if this is something that you want to include in your licensing regulations.
Great. Any questions or comments about number 4 from anyone?
So
All right.
this kind of came up. Moving on to number 5 is background checks, and came up in our previous conversation. So the state is looking at felonies in the last 5 years. This is an opportunity that, if they have their state background check and there's no felonies and they're issued the state license, what is their additional concerns? And if there's something that the assembly is specifically concerned about, that they don't want to see operators that have XYZ on their background check, this might be an opportunity to address that. I think the con is the background checks are expensive. The state is getting the fingerprint FBI background checks, which I think is like $100, and it could additional penalties on the licensee to have to pay for it twice. So just an opportunity for the assembly to identify if they have additional concerns beyond what the state has identified.
Well, and Amanda, it might be a situation where, a community council has questions about an individual and decides that we need to do an additional or more thorough background check or something.
And so something to consider with your licensing is that maybe you wouldn't require it with the application, but you could have a requirement should it be requested or something. So, something to consider, that there's a significant cost to them and that they're already having to get it once for the state, and so to not be duplicative.
Right. Makes sense. Any questions about
Shouldn't be restricted to do it, to not doing it, and use the judgment in terms of, is it necessary? Do they have enough citizen complaints or something like that? Or is there some reason to believe that the background check that was done before was not accurate or something? I guess the ability to do so would probably be.
Amy? Mr. Bosky?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say, just listening to what the state's going to require for a background check, it seems to me these things will happen in clear succession. It'll go to the state, it'll come to the assembly or to the clerk's office, as long as that background check is current. So I would put some sort of time frame on it. They did get their license and then wait, 8 months or something. But the other thing you have to say is when we start saying, if there's a concern that comes up at a community council, and so we're going to investigate further, I think we have to be very cautious to have a clear, measurable, or clear standard. That way we're not being arbitrary in our process, and people can't say that they're unfairly being targeted. We have the same process for everyone. And, like I said, if something comes up, whether it's a time frame or, somebody, I don't even know, because we're not doing, I don't know through the FBI or through that background check what they're looking for as far as felonies from other states. I don't know what pops up on those background checks. But I guess if somebody were to come to the guy, who's a drug dealer convicted in Rhode Island, I don't know if that would pop up on that thing. But the only thing I would say is the state's background check probably will be sufficient as long as it's current within a certain amount of time. And if there's other factors that we need to look into, I think we just need to articulate that to the clerk's office. But I think it needs to be uniform.
Thank Ms. Domboski, and I was thinking that if it's someone who'd recently moved to Alaska, hadn't been here for 5 years, you may require a background check from, the lower 48. Amy, or Amanda, excuse me.
Just to clarify, the way the regs are written right now, the state is requesting the applicant to submit fingerprints and obtain a report of criminal justice information and a national criminal history record. So if somebody did move from Rhode Island, it would be my understanding that they would catch.
You would think so, yes. You have a comment, Ms. Domboski?
No, that answers my question. That's helpful, very helpful. And like I said, it sounds to me like the state's asking for, a substantial background check. So with that said, it seems reasonable to me that that should suffice so long as it is current. And that current being something that we have to stipulate is the time frame, I don't think one that's 2 years old is current, but I can't imagine somebody investing that much money would wait 2 years to try to get a city license either.
Right, I don't think so either. Ms. Tucker and
Just to clarify, if the assembly is having just the same, is not enhancing whatever the state has, will that background check come through as part of the application that you were talking about, that you envision that the person will be able to submit their state application?
That is a legal question that I don't know the answer to, but it's something that I have highlighted. I'm not sure if it's my understanding that the ABC board is the one that pulls the background check for the applicant, and I think that they maintain it as part of their files, and I do not know if that would be able to come to our agency, but I think that's a great question that we can come back to.
And to the chair, while we're researching that question, one potential workaround would be to say that the municipal license is contingent on the applicant holding a valid state license, so that if the municipal background, the background check failed at the state level, even if we could never see it, we would still be able to reject the issuance of the municipal license.
right, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
All right, move forward.
Moving on to number 6, do we want to include fines for violation of any of the marijuana licensing requirements? This is something that we currently have in our municipal Title 10, which is our business license code section. There's certain requirements that our licensees have, and if they are out of compliance with them, we are able to issue fines through either APD or code enforcement. This might be an area to make sure that our licensees are following specific requirements, so that would give assembly control over this new industry. Con, it could, fines could impede development of this new industry. For alcohol, we currently do not issue fines on that, but as I mentioned, we do issue them with code enforcement and APD on our other Title 10 business licenses. I know it's something that we've used to address problems with tow operators in the past. We added some additional fines. So just something to keep into consideration.
Mr. Trainee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From my perspective, Amanda, I want to see us operate the same way we do the towing industry. Just when you're keeping count, just keep in mind that I will bring it forward if it's not in there, because it's working for a towing industry. That way, our code enforcement officers can give them a fine.
Yeah.
Ensures compliance.
We could set up a system even where it's like a verbal warning and then a fine or something.
Whatever you come up with.
Anything else on number 6 before we go to 7?
Moving on to
Here we
number
go.
7, do we want APD to review license applications? Pro APD may have additional information regarding the operators or locations that is available to the business license official. I think it would promote public safety to keep APD in the loop of all of the licenses before they've been approved. The con is that it would require additional staffing or time to review. And one element where it's like alcohol, APD signs off on all of the catering permits that are issued within the municipality of Anchorage.
Mr.
From my
Trainee?
perspective, Amanda, I'd want APD to look at the licenses first. They may have information that we don't have. I'd really like to have them on board for it.
Thanks, Mr. Trainee. Ms. Domboski?
Yes, I just have to agree with Mr. Trainee. You know, sometimes APD can give us a lot of information. People that own businesses, many calls for services of those businesses, and it can be helpful. So I think APD should be involved in the process.
Well, and I would think if the state is doing background checks, they would probably, might be checking with local law enforcement as part of that background check to see if they've got any information on some. I don't know if that is the way it works or not, but it seems like that would make common sense to me. But any other questions or comments about number 7?
Well, the only other thing I'd say, Mr. Chair, is sometimes not every contact with APD will actually register as an offense. But sometimes, you know, they might have somebody who owns a bar, and, you know, that bar, they've gone there, you know, 15 times in the last month for X, or you know, whatever. And so we've seen it in other alcohol deliberations where those calls for services we've had those discussions, but it's not necessarily something I don't think that will show up in the court system if somebody's doing a background check like that. So that's why I think it's still helpful to have APD as part of the process.
All right, great, thank you. Let's go to number 8, Amanda.
So both questions 8 and 9 specifically deal with what is written in the state regs right now. Number 8 deals with the limits of marijuana sold in retail stores. This is an area where if the assembly wants to have additional control, additional limitations, they could include that in the license. And then number 10 is the hours of operation for retail stores. They're listed as being closed from 12 midnight until 8 in the morning. And like liquor licensing, the liquor licenses statewide, the hours of operation are just different from the municipality of Anchorage. So just presenting these as, I think as the state begins to finalize their regulations, will on the municipal level approach these different sections and sort of hash out if we are comfortable with the state, what the state has identified, or if the municipality of Anchorage wants additional control. And number 9, just to hop down to the last one, insurance requirements is currently in the state regulations. I have heard that it's potentially getting pulled out, so I'm just I don't know if that might not be true, but I'm just leaving it there as something to consider if it does get pulled out. Do we want to require it on the municipal level?
Are you talking about liability insurance? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Ms. Domboski, do you have a question?
You know, I wasn't in the queue, but I was just going to say, but I will be now that you call on me. I would just say, when it comes to, you know, the insurance, I recognize because of the substance, this could be a tricky one, but every other professional business, I think, is required some sort of insurance, whether it's, you know, workman's comp or whatever. So I think just to blanket say, no, you don't need insurance, maybe I'm not understanding the question.
So if I could respond, I think that it's not required at all, but having specific insurance requirements. So in the amount of $1 million or whatever.
Okay, so
and part of the conversation, I'm sorry to interrupt, that I've heard with it is that because of the federal ban, that it's expensive and challenging to find insurance companies that will provide it, and that it's significantly more expensive to get insurance for these kind of industries than for just, you know, an ice cream shop or whatever.
Right. Well, and you know, to me, I guess I have very little sympathy in this realm, because it's like somebody who gets into the alcohol industry and they want to own a bar. The insurance required to own a bar, that liability insurance, is much more than the liability insurance for somebody who has a hair salon. And so I think that's just part of doing business. But I think we need parity. So I think we need to look at some of these other industries that provide, you know, services or substances, and say, what do we require for insurance for them, if any, and then we should have parity.
I see. Mr. Trainee.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Amanda, you might check with risk management and just have them look and see, give us some suggestions, because I can't see going forward without any insurance at all, but I don't want to drive them broke. with insurance they can get. So let's find out from risk management what's out there.
And insurance is currently required in the state regs. I've heard that it's potentially getting pulled out. I don't
Is Bruce
know.
pulling it out?
Speak to that?
Yeah, Bruce.
No. Through the chair, Mr. Drain. Ms. Mosher is correct. There was a discussion about this, and an extensive discussion last week, and where we fell was kind of what you just articulated. We didn't want to remove all requirement for the insurance, but we also didn't want to burden them with a specific dollar amount. So we left in the requirement for insurance, we removed the specific dollar amount.
And then if you check with risk management, they can probably give us a good idea of what level they'd be comfortable with.
Okay, so maybe that's an area where the state just has the insurance requirement, but in the municipality, you would have a specific dollar amount.
Mm-hmm. I think that's appropriate.
There may be a local insurance agency that decides they want to specialize in this type of insurance.
And-
It's a new market.
Yeah, there's,
Ma'am?
Yes.
Yeah, and Mr. Peterson brings up a valid point. There are insurance carriers who have expressed an interest and a willingness to work with this industry, and I'm hoping that more will get on board once we got the regs worked out, and so hopefully that will keep the cost down and broaden the availability of carriers. I honestly don't know of anybody who's planning to operate a legitimate, regulated business, certainly within Anchorage, who wouldn't recognize that that's an appropriate and unavoidable cost of doing business. I mean, a lot of us are going to have significant investment in our property, and I haven't heard a rational reason yet for not having insurance.
Mr.
There
Steele is
isn't one,
actually.
Bruce. There isn't one.
I would agree with you, Mr. Bowden.
Protecting themselves and their investment is one thing in terms of something that they'll want to do. But I think they have to have certainly liability insurance of some sort to protect the public. My concern is that they're buying a product. If there's something wrong with that product and they die or something, then there's some liability there, and they need to have enough insurance that they don't just claim bankruptcy and leave town.
Exactly.
There needs to be some liability insurance.
Yeah, and I would think that, I was a small business owner for most of my career, and you always hated to pay the premiums, but it helped you sleep at night knowing that you had that coverage, So, do you have anything else we
didn't go over number 3, but I'd like to, if possible, reserve the right to come back to that. I think as we continue these conversations and understand how licensing and land use will travel, I think that might be a better time to come back to how we specifically work with putting these items before the body. I know Erica and I had a conversation about it last week and had some ideas, and we're still working them out. So if I could just reserve the right to come back on
Sure.
those.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a moving target at this point. So, let me see, next on our agenda.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a quick question?
You certainly can, Ms. Dombowski, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is for Bruce. On number 3, I had made a note here. When we're looking at school licensing, what is the state looking at for their license? Is it something that'll have to be reduced? And if so, is it like every year, every 2 years? What are you looking at?
Through the chair, Ms. Dombowski, it's an annual renewal?
So yearly?
Yeah.
Because my thought on the number 3 was something like, initially when we get going, it sounds like we'll have to go through a tighter process to get a state license. And so that will be helpful for the municipality being able to, rely on that process to kind of weed out the applicants when they hit our process. But a great time to offer feedback, I think, would maybe not be on the initial issue, but on the renewal. I think that's just the thought. But, obviously from a municipal standpoint, I think the dual licensing system is better than the one we deal with right now with the conditional use system. So I think if we're moving in the dual license arena, it's maybe not as important that we're putting feedback to the state license, because we have the opportunity to just
see. Any comments on that subject? Addition? Okay, next on the agenda, we need to set a date, time for our next public town hall meeting. And I don't know, does Ernie have anything down on his calendar at this point? It's wide open. Ms. Mosier, you have any ideas, any suggestions?
That might be something we could also revisit when Ernie is back.
He gets back on around the 15th, I believe.
No direction on that, so.
13th? Okay. All right, we can come back to that.
Mr. Chair, can I butt in one more time?
Yes, Ms. Dombrowski.
Sorry, I know it's tough being on the phone. So just going back to Amanda's questions that she's posing to the committee, was the intent, because Ernie's not here today, not to give direction, or is the intent to try to answer some of the questions today?
Good question.
Through the chair, I think that we recognize that it's somewhat of a moving target until the state finalizes it, but I wanted to allow the assembly to start thinking about what we're thinking about internally as far as licensing goes. And I think that I have the sense on some of these of the feeling of the body, and can work on that with work from that direction. But if you guys want to go through and specifically give me yes
Well,
and no's.
I made some notes, and I obviously just speak for myself, but I'm sure you don't have a client bunch in front of you, so if they disagree, I'm sure they'll speak up. You know, for me, when I was making notes as we're talking, number one, I think I'm firming up on the no side of that. Number two, no. Number three, I'm thinking, you know, we might explore during the renewal phase for the state, but I don't know that this is really that critical because we're going to be having our own licenses. But number four, I was going to ask Bruce, do you know what the state is going to be doing when it comes to requiring inspections for marijuana establishments?
There, through the chair, Ms. Dombrowski, there are stipulations that these licensees they have to abide by not just the state's marijuana regs, but also building codes, fire codes, things like that. So I think it's the expectation that the degree of inspection that would be appropriate for a bar or for a brewery or a package store would certainly be appropriate for a marijuana facility, and probably with some additional level of scrutiny just depending on the nature of the facility. For example, a grow operation, may an inspector might want to visit there to look at what kind of fertilizer they're using, or if they're using pesticides, or something like that, or if they are indeed accounting for all of the plants on the premises in the manner that is prescribed. So I think the minimum level of inspection is probably going to be what you would find at a bar or restaurant, and it's likely to be a little bit higher than that.
Okay, that's helpful. I think that's a topic for the municipality. I don't think out of hand you want to just say no, we'll never inspectors have that opportunity, because I think that could be another tool that can be helpful, especially with potential problem operators. Number 5, I think we should do it similar to the state. It doesn't mean if somebody has a great idea, we can't add something to it. But I think, especially if they're going to a nationwide federal background check, I think that probably will suffice. And I was under the understanding before that there was also going to be a credit check associated with this. Is that right, Bruce?
To the chairman, Ms. Dombrowski, I do not recall seeing that in there. I don't think a credit check is currently part of the regulations.
Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Bosky. Mr. Steele has a question or a comment.
Yeah, my question was just to build on what Mr. Bosky said in terms of the inspections. It seems to me it depends upon the type of operation. If it's a grow operation, you may be concerned about fertilizers and pests. If it's a processing operation, you may be concerned about gases and explosions and so on and so forth. So the type of inspection and probably the amount of inspections would vary in a public operation. If it's a sales, it may be just a meeting law.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would think that initial inspections, when they're first starting out, might be more stringent. And then once they're up and operating, unless there's a complaint from someone, then they may only be inspected when they're applying for renewal or something.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful. Am I jumping out of queue? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
No, I think you're right. I think that the initial inspections will probably be more uniform, more substantial, because in part they're going to want to verify that the facility was in fact set up to run in the manner described in the application process, because the application will require a floor plan, an operating plan, a security plan, some other parameters. So I think it'll be incumbent on the licensee to demonstrate that they've actually met the obligation that they committed to in making the application.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
And then Mr. Chair, I'll just finish really quick and give Amanda my answers. Number 5, I thought similar. Number 6, I want to say yes to that. Number 7, I would say yes. Number 8, I really don't know yet. And I think that's one that we should go back and revisit in more depth. But I would like to see, I just like to see perception first, because I don't know. And number 10, hours of operation, really limiting it to 8 to 12. I think honestly the market will determine if they need to be closed more than that. I don't know, but I think that sounds reasonable to me. But lastly, for the insurance question, I think the police is a little bit expect that anybody in an industry or service industry or industry providing a product has to have some sort of liability insurance. And I think Mr. Steele hit the nail on the head. I think it was Mr. Steele that said it. But it has to have a reasonable amount of insurance. That way, if they sell a bad product and somebody gets hurt, they just don't go bankrupt, and then people don't have any regrets. So I think reasonable amount of insurance is can be expected. And those are my answers.
Thank you, Mr. Bosky. Any members of the committee have any more comments today? Amanda?
Can I just clarify on the inspections? I know we kind of moved on from that. Currently with liquor licenses, we have inspections before the establishment begins operating. So there's an inspection from AF Anchorage Fire Department, building safety, etc. And then what I was talking about in this specific document was, I would think that we would still have that level of inspections to issue a license, but if you had inspections throughout the operation of the business, so either you required an inspection from code enforcement. And so my thought with the inspection was, it's not building safety or Anchorage Fire Department after the license is operating, but a code enforcement officer to make sure that that licensee is specifically following the requirements of the Anchorage Municipal Code.
Yeah, I got that out of that, Amanda, and I would say at this point I would not be willing to check that off the list. I think that's a good opportunity. How often you do that, or if they're random, or if they're routine, that's something I think all all opportunities should be on the table, honestly. But that's something I would not out of hand just say no, we don't want to do that. I think it's a good tool to retain.
Well, I think inspections probably need to be surprise inspections. People shouldn't be notified in advance, say, we're going to inspect you on Friday. I was in the restaurant industry for years, and we did the cleaning every single day, expecting the inspector to come tomorrow, and that was the attitude you had to have, because otherwise things could kind of become slipshod after a while,
Yeah, I think you're right. And the way code enforcement operates now, a lot of it is complaint driven. But at the same point, especially in an industry like this, the ABC board goes in and does random inspections. They'll have those younger kids go in and try to buy alcohol. And so I think that's just it's a tool when you're selling substance, like this or like alcohol or anything else that potentially has risk. I think it's just a tool that the municipality can use.
All right. Mr. Trainee?
The problem with the ABC board, they go in and they do a violation that doesn't take effect for a year until it goes to court. We don't find out about it until we have it coming up for renewal, and then we pull the ABC violation and find out that was a year ago, and they told the person never to do it again or get TAMS training. I want us to have our enforcement officers a little bit more rapid response back to us. So Amanda, I'm with you on this, okay? Thank you.
And we need to have full, open, frequent communication with the state.
Yeah, that communication with the state, that is very, very important, especially through the clerk's office, that you're going to be working on this. You'll
It's-
probably need to get to know whoever's in the department in Juneau or wherever it is on a first-name basis.
The clerk's office works really closely with the ABC board. I think both Cindy Franklin and Sarah Oates have been in communication with us, and we're in communication with them. So we are really thankful for that working relationship that we have.
And I was going to ask Mr. Schulte if he had any additional information he wanted to provide to the committee today, since you got here a little bit late.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep it brief because I know we're we're running short on time. But I did just come from the Marijuana Control Board meeting, and what we did was we finished our first review, our review of the first draft of the regulations. After some tidying up, all 9 articles of the regs in draft form will be posted for public review, hopefully by October 6th. So there'll be an opportunity to see any changes we made last week or this week. And again, it's still in draft form, but that's going to be out there. So there's some subtle changes perhaps that Ms. Mosier hasn't seen, because frankly we didn't make them until today. But there was at least one that actually spoke to today's discussion, so I think it'll be helpful. We're having 2 days of oral comment here in Anchorage on the 15th and 16th of October. The deadline for written public comment is November 11th, and we're meeting again on November 20th, hopefully to adopt the final regulations.
Okay, so the public could make oral comments on the 15th and 16th of October?
Yes.
And what location is that going to be?
I believe that's going to be at the LIO.
The LIO.
But we may get bumped with by the legislature. So that remains to be seen. But that's the hope, because we want to be tied in with the other LIOs around the state. So we're expecting comment from other.
My clerk's office, maybe you can get the assembly chambers.
That would be an awesome backup plan. Well, the key thing I'm hoping for is that we can hook in with the LIOs and Fairbanks and Juneau as well. But I appreciate the offer. That would be terrific if we could do that.
Keep that in mind. Ms. Tucker?
Going back to the item on the agenda about the next town hall meeting, I think it might be helpful to figure out if you wanted to have that town hall meeting after the state regs were finalized, and how much more time kind of after that, given the assembly schedule, but also the schedule for the clerk's office, when that input would be most beneficial. So at least you sort of tie in the purpose of the next town hall meeting, even if you're going to wait for a date when Mr. Hall gets back, so that it's not just, if you don't have any kind of a momentum going, any kind of a process, then it just kind of drops off.
Well, that sounds good. That we should, and since Mr. Hall's going to be back before the 15th, I think he said the 13th, he'd be available shortly after the 16th. Maybe we could try to line up a location and have a town hall.
Ira and I can communicate with Ernie and work on setting up a date and send it out to the rest of the committee.
And when we see, we had the last thing we had it over at the Goosack Library, is that right?
We had it in the assembly chambers, so it allowed for the public to come and address the assembly that was there.
That worked out fine, as I recall. Well, any other comments or questions from anyone before we adjourn the meeting today? Comments, questions from the public?
Yeah, I have a public comment. I wanted to provide some clarifying information about transferable and limited licenses, and I also had a question.
Who's that talking?
Sorry, this is Anna Brawley. I'm a Turnigan resident, and I also wanted to address a question directly to the committee rather than in writing. The clarifying information is that licenses can be limited without being transferable, and they really should be considered two separate things. They're conflated in Title IV, and part of the issues in Title IV is that they have become quasi-properties. You're not buying the right to the license, you're buying the right to apply for the license as the first person in line. And that has created a great deal of case law. If you look through Title IV, I mean, about 30% of the case law that's referenced in the booklet of Title IV is about people misunderstanding that or kind of questioning whether or not they have the right to that license. So I would encourage you to look at the state of Washington. They have limits at the state level on the number of licenses that do not require transferability. When you are done with your license, you turn it back in, and you can call the Liquor Control Board. I've spoken to them. So that's the first thing I would encourage you to look at and not to conflate those two things. Second is, as a member of a community council, for alcohol licenses, the renewal period, as Ms. Dombrowski said, is one of the most important times for community councils to have input, not just the municipality as the staff and the assembly and the mayor. So if the city forfeit that right to comment on state licenses, we're forfeiting one of the most important things in the state application process. The ABC board has said time and again that they look at the local jurisdiction's input in that process. So even if there is a dual license, I personally don't think that it's a good idea to forfeit that power away from the local government. And then my third comment is something that I emailed about on September 14th to the assembly members of this committee, that I just wanted to get more clarification on why Mr. Schulte was appointed as an ex officio prior to his appointment to the ABC board, and just trying to understand why a non-assembly member is appointed as a committee member, because I see that there are other input coming from municipal staff, but they're not considered committee members. I understand that ex officio is not voting, but to me that looks like the appearance of impropriety, because Mr. Schulte, prior to being appointed to the ABC or the MCB, was a well-known industry advocate, was part of the initiative, and so that looks to me like having an industry advocate on a government committee and having an official position, even if it's not a voting position. So I just wanted clarification from the committee what the thought was, whether you've considered appointing people from other sectors, public safety, public health, to kind of get a more balanced view, or why there's a different position.
Well, in my opinion, I was in favor of adding Mr. Schulte to our committee because he had specific knowledge. There are members of the assembly and of this committee that don't have much of a background in marijuana growing and retailing and manufacturing and processing. And so we thought that it would be nice to have someone on our committee that had maybe a little more expertise in this field than what some of us had. And I actually feel that he's done an excellent job as a member of the committee by providing information, especially since he was named to the Marijuana Control Board. So we're able to get information from him directly shortly after the meeting was adjourned, and so that we're up to date on where the state is in the developing of some of their regulations and laws. So in my opinion, I had no problem with him being added as a non-voting member of this committee for those reasons. Mr. Trainee and Mr. Stevens?
Ernie asked me if you could have him. I told him, go ahead. As far as I'm concerned, he's got
I'm not
to choose from you.
ready, but, we have public input at most of our public meetings, but it was nice to have a particular expertise on board. He was willing, and I think it was good. It has been.
Oh, appreciate that. If it's any consolation, I don't get paid for any of this.
And I should say too, I don't have anything personally against your input, and I see the value of having that input. I just think it creates the appearance of undue influence when it's a position that's called ex officio on a government committee. And because my understanding is you were added before you were appointed to the board.
That's true.
And so it was not a contingent on you being a member of the state board. And I see that there's a lot of other people giving input, but they do not have that same position on the committee. So that's, I guess, what I'm objecting to.
All right.
Any comments?
I don't see a great benefit to being on the board as an ex-official member, not voting on it. And what that does is it makes him feel a commitment, so it shows up. And that's a good thing.
Will tell you, we have other boards and commissions, we have ex-officio members on other boards.
Do they represent other jurisdictions, or are they?
For example, on our Title 21, the name has been changed, Amy's in charge of it. We have 2 people from Planning and Zoning Commission on that one. So it's been used before. We simply get people who want to volunteer and we bring them onto it, if they're appropriate.
Right. Sir?
My name's Mark Maligo. We had a question for Ms. Schulte. You talked about the security covering every square inch for grow and retail operations. Has there been any discussion on testing, since there's going to be much less product in the testing lab, whether you're going to have the same type of security required in the testing lab?
There are requirements for surveillance. I couldn't, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly what those are.
So they are different, though?
I'm not sure if they are. Honestly, I was much of the discussion really focused around the grow and retail operations because there were some specific concerns there. I'm pretty sure that they apply to testing facilities. I don't know if they are precisely the same parameters, but I suspect they are. Honestly, I'd have to go back.
Do you think that maybe it wouldn't have to be quite as stringent, given that there's very little product?
Yeah, honestly, at this point, I wouldn't want to express a personal opinion on that because it is going back up for public comment, and I can't tell you where that will fall or how the board would view that comment.
All right, thank you.
Any other comments from the public? Suggestions? Okay. Well, I guess our next meeting is going to be on the 22nd of October from 4 to 5 p.m. in this room. And so I'll take a motion to adjourn. Anybody second that motion?
I'll second. Just for fun.
We're adjourned.